everybody. This is Cole and Jamie Boling with the Boling Group at Keller Williams One Legacy Partners in Topeka, and we are your husband and wife real estate team. And today we're going to be picking up where we left off on the last video, which was going over our Topeka real estate contract. We are going into the second part of page 2. This is number 3 on. So what we're going to talk about right away is the closing date and possession. As one of the 5 key elements of a contract, when we're going to buy it is one of the most important things. So in this section, we're going to determine when we're going to buy it and when we're going to get possession of the property. Not every deal gives possession at closing when you come to the table. What we do determine is what that looks like. So let's say you're closing at 5 on or before. So as we're looking at this, we would put on or before 5 p.m. on Friday, today's date, whatever. So September 10th on or before 5 p.m. Then we may get to the next section, say we will take possession by noon on September 12th, Sunday at noon, right? So we would specify exactly when that would be. We typically do our best to try to get closing and possession at the same time. We also always make sure that funding is there, because sometimes if we have a late in the day closing on Friday, funding will not show up until Monday morning. And sometimes that can delay you actually taking ownership and possession of that property.
The other thing you want to look at too is if it's a holiday weekend, you want to really pay attention to those dates, especially if you're a seller looking at buying a property after you sell your other house. So these are things that you would want to talk to your agent about. And this is something that Cole and I both look at whenever we are helping a seller or a buyer close on their home, and figure that out up front when we're negotiating the contract.
Absolutely. Then we get into the section about new mortgages. Closing agents have a fee. There's a fee for the closing agent. And what we typically determine is who's going to pay for that right away. Is it the seller, the buyer, or are we going to split that evenly? This is not the closing cost of the transaction. This is just a closing fee for the title company that is going to close that, or the banker who's going to close that. If they have a fee of $200, $500, who's paying for it? And we determine that up front. Okay, moving into section 4. So section 4 is taxes and other items that will be prorated. It's a very standard uniform section here. Kansas, we pay taxes in the rear. So what that means is every 6 months, we're paying for the last 6 months, or every year we're paying for the following. So what we determine is when we close a property, you usually get a credit as a buyer from the seller for the amount of time they've owned the property in that current calendar year. Taxes
until you close.
Yep, to that day. So then your money from that will go into what's called an escrow account. The bank will then make that part of your prepaids. So you will hear things like closing costs and prepaids. The funds that you get from the seller in that section typically do go into your prepaid account. Then when the tax bill comes due, the bank pays that out of your escrow account, and it's taken care of for the entire year of, let's say, 2021. So you'll see a credit from a seller because you're gonna have to pay that yourself in the future. Okay. So here, all we're going to do is we're going to put in the calendar year that the current assessed taxes on the county taxes are being assessed based on. So if they're now assessed on 2021, we're going to put that there. Typically, they're going to be still assessed on 2020. So we're going to put 2020 and then a proration of 2021. And we will put in there usually the closing date. We'll put typically the closing date in there so that we can make sure that you do get credit all the way up until that date. Following that, we do have what is called specials. Sometimes properties do have special taxes. So what we determine is if there are special taxes, we need to make sure that those are also included in the tax proration and they're not something separate. So we do have a section where we do the general and the year of the assessment there.
And a side note too is if there are specials, there will be another disclosure that you would sign off on. That way you are aware as the seller and as the buyer what those are, what fees they are, and what they include for the prices there for the taxes.
Yep, Jamie, you're exactly right. And as it says on the bottom, it is called a seller's special assessment disclosure addendum, and it outlines every single one of those specials. You may be asking yourself, what the heck is a special? A special is sometimes the roads, the sewer lines, utilities, easement additions, pond rebuilds, things like that, that affect the neighborhood as a whole.
What they did to get that neighborhood up and running, they put into a special tax.
Yes. And that typically does last for about 20 to 25 years on average from the day of creation. So, all right, going into number 5, a marketable title. This is one of the most crucial pieces and one of the biggest parts of our contract that gives both parties an out of a contract. What this says is the seller will make the buyer a marketable title, which means that they have a good title. It's going to be able to be transferred to them at the time of closing. If that seller cannot produce a good title on their property, the buyer has an out. The seller also does. So going into the next page.
So basically a little bit about title too is if you are buying the property and there's a lien on there, as you know, a mechanic's lien or something like that, the seller will not be able to sell you that property until that mechanic's lien has been paid. So if you got into a property and you didn't have a title done on your property that you purchased, and later on come to find out that there is a mechanic's lien on that property that you purchased, you will be responsible for that mechanic's lien. It will stay on that property. So it's
Yes.
very, very important that we get title work done.
Absolutely. So the other aspect of that is there have been times where title companies have found that the seller or somebody is not the legal owner, or there's a spouse that was not signed off.
Yep.
They will make sure that nobody can ever come back to you and say, you're not the rightful owner of this property. You actually do pay for an insurance policy as well as the seller does to protect both sides. So if something like that does come up, you are protected, and typically you won't have somebody come in and taking your property back from you. That's why it's such a crucial part of all real estate deals.
Yeah, and we actually had this happen to us when we bought our very first house. We had a seller who was single, and he had been single for, I don't know,
20 years,
and he thought that he owned the house outright and that his ex-wife was completely off of it. Come to find out, we did the title work and she was still on the house. So we had to track her down. They hadn't spoken
in 20 years. It wasn't a good situation.
And they found her and she signed off on everything. So it was very good that we had that done. But
yeah. And she was like in Georgia. They didn't even know how to find her. We ended up finding her. That's why you work with us. It happens to us personally, but we work with the best professionals in the industry to make sure that they are finding all of those details that could come back to haunt you.
Right. And then of course you just want to make sure that we get the initials on the bottom of each page, like we said before in our previous video, but
yep.
Seller's initials and the buyer's initials. All right, so there we go.
All right. So what we come across is we always determine what kind of title work we're doing immediately. We know that the properties usually are going to be for residential use. If a property is zoned commercial and you're trying to go residential, we cannot just change the zoning. We have to go with what it is zoned, and we will write that typically on this part right here. Mm-hmm. Then we have things that we have properties that may have like tenants living in them. We would determine here, let's say a tenant has the rights to the property until the end of September or the end of December. We would say tenant has rights to property till the end of December, and then we would put that information there. This is where we would make sure that all of those things are looked for so that they can provide a general warranty deed or a special deed that needs to transfer with the property.
This is where it comes in really beneficial. If you're buying an investment property that's already established, they already have tenants in the property and you're going to take it over. This is where we would have to make sure, because if you are taking it over, you have to continue on that contract that they already had in place for those tenants. So yes. This is very important.
Yes. Okay, so number 6, this is what she was talking about with the liens. We are going to make sure that all liens from contractors, subcontractors, laborers, basically mechanics liens, any liens from like utility companies, liens from mortgages themselves, all of those are going to be looked into and found. And if they are on the property, they will be taken care of by the closing agent prior to closing, so that does not transfer to you as a new buyer. All right, number 7, escrow. So this is where in page 1, we talked about your earnest money, right? So earnest money goes into what's called an escrow account. An escrow account is held by a third-party company that is a highly regulated account, and it's typically held by a title company, or some real estate offices do have their own escrow company inside of their business. We do not hold checks. We do not like touching your checks. So what we do is we partner with a title company that we trust, and we would then market that title company. So when an offer was to come in, we would know, or the other agent would know, where to put the name of that title company so that everybody is aware of who's holding that money. And that's what we would put in number 7. Pretty simple. And then moving on down, the number 8 is the interim maintenance. So this is quite an interesting topic that doesn't come up often, but it does come up. What this says is the seller will maintain the property and its improvements in the present condition and deliver it in like or better than present condition once they close. We do see people trash houses. We do see people not clean. We do see things like that happen. They can be in breach of a contract, depending upon the level of damage or the level of things that happen. There could be multiple avenues of legal ramifications on this. So we do determine upfront, signed by all parties, that the seller will maintain that property and deliver it in a much better, equal to or much better condition than it was at the time of showings. All right, number 9, very simple. You got to get homeowners insurance. We have determined by the contract a specific date that you will have homeowners insurance in place. Typically, it's a week prior to closing. That's where we typically write, is because we want to know that you can get homeowners insurance, not the day of closing, but at least a week prior. And then what an alert that we have on these contracts is buyer needs to be aware that that federally designed high risk flood areas are subject to change. So you may not be in a flood zone today. You might be in a flood zone the day after you close. We have no control over that. Nobody has control over that. It's typically not going to happen. However, we do have to determine that if a 100-year flood was to happen and the whole area was to shift in its topography, then you could end up being in a floodplain one day, which would require you to have what's called flood insurance, which is a separate insurance policy for your lender.
And that is part of your prepaids through your lender as well, because they do charge you to do a flood certificate, and they look at that every single time. So if you're in a flood zone, you will more than likely, unless your dwelling is not in the actual flood zone, you'll more than likely have to have flood insurance on the property. So it's very important to know if you are or aren't.
And just because a property is in a floodplain doesn't mean the house that you're living in is in the floodplain. If the house itself does not touch the floodplain, you do not have to have insurance typically.
From our knowledge.
From our knowledge. So moving on to number 10, lead-based paint. Only a big deal if you buy a house that was built prior to 1978. Not 1978, but prior to it. So we do get this question every once in a while, is what does this even mean? Well, they used to use a hazardous paint that was made from lead that they found caused many medical issues for kids and people, because it would absorb into the soil around the property, and the soil would then go into the water, and the water from there was then recirculated into the water supply, and people were drinking it. So, and then the kids that like to eat paint chips, as a lot of people like to joke about. However, that's why it is very, very important that we determine, and we do a addendum that talks about if there is known
lead-based paint,
you do have the right for 10 days to have it as any house built prior to 1978 assessed to make sure it does or does not. Typically, most houses that were built prior to 1978 by now have been painted again, have been painted maybe multiple times. So there may be presence of lead-based paint way down deep in that. The likeliness of any exposure at this point has become more and more rare as the years go on.
Of course, we always recommend that you talk to a professional. So
yes. All right. Now we're moving into the section of disclosures. This is the most crucial aspect of every real estate transaction, the seller's disclosure about the property. One of the things that I will tell you is people don't always like to tell you the bad things about homes.
The full truth.
What we determine is we need a document stating all of that, and we have that document. The document is 4 pages long. It's very detailed, lots of check boxes, lots of fill in the blanks, and that is when the seller has the opportunity to disclose anything. If they disclose it and you don't request anything to be done about it at the time of offer, there is nothing you can do about it if it's found again in the time of inspection. So read details of the seller's disclosure.
And address it prior to going officially under contract.
Yes, or make it as a special part, which we'll get to later in these contracts.
Right.
Now, there will be times that you may buy a property, let's say a foreclosure. They will not have a seller's disclosure. They will more than likely never tell you anything about the property.
And they usually won't do any updates.
They won't do anything for you. If you buy a property that was owned by a landlord company or a company that is typically not living there or never have lived there, or a family member that has never lived there, and they will mark a seller's disclosure completely blank and say, I never lived here. They are the most liable people, believe it or not, for a home. If somebody was, everybody knows something about a house if they have any ownership of it, because landlords always have maintenance records of houses. Homeowners of like a deceased family member that's taking over property knows at one point, more than likely, something that happened on that property, or there's probably been receipts of certain things. So it is in your best interest as a buyer to never accept a blank seller's disclosure statement. Always ask for a seller's disclosure statement to be filled out to the best of their knowledge. And that is what we have for today. And remember, always initial the bottom of each page.
Yep, that's all we have for. Yep, that's what I was going to say. But and then just the date on there that the seller's disclosure was filled out by the seller. We just have to put that on there. So we know that you saw the exact same one that they filled out. So
once again, we are Cole and Jamie Boling with the Boling Group, Keller Williams One Legacy Partners. And stay tuned for the next video, which will go into the next couple pages. See ya.
See ya.